Before you dive into your first design assignment, I wanted to go over a brief history of the various design styles, and I think that might be helpful for you when you're doing thumbnail designs and trying out different styles for your label design here. Now, if you look back in the 20th century, if you pick any one decade, you can pretty much peg one design style to it. If it's the 20s and 30s, we think of Art Deco design, modernism of the 1950s, psychedelic design in the 60s, or maybe grunge design in the 90s. And one of the things that's interesting is we've just concluded the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and it's really hard to pick a particular style that you can assign to either the 20-aughts or the 20-teens. The reason for that, no one's really sure. The two best guesses are it's a combination of, well, it really comes down to technology. The design software, the digital design software that we all use really came into being in the 1990s, and in 1995, the internet as we know it was born. And what happened is now you had examples of design throughout time at your fingertips with one click. And with the digital software, you had the ability to replicate those designs very easily. So what you do see in a lot of contemporary design of the last 20 years are modern variations on older styles. Now, there's nothing new about that. As we go through the lecture, I want you to notice a couple things. If we think about the grunge design of the 1990s, there's a very, very direct path back to a school of design or art called Dada in the 1919 or 1920s. If you look at the kind of geometric design of the 1980s, you can see reflections of the geometric design from the Art Deco period. So designers have always been riffing on previous design styles, but now it seems like it's more prevalent than before. So when we talk about design styles for graphic design, we really don't go any further back than the Victorian era of the 1800s. The reason for that is the Victorian era, which is named after Queen Victoria, coincided with a lot of advances in manufacturing, a lot of more mechanized things as an extension of the Industrial Revolution. And it was also the emergence of the middle class. And suddenly you have people with disposable income to buy services and products. And what you see in the advertising and packaging of the time is this kind of ability to kind of try and lure people with really extravagant design, lots of color, multiple fonts, lots of decorative scrolls and shields, anything to attract attention to your project. Now, when we talk about Victorian design, or when we talk about modern design, there's a general rule of thumb among graphic designers that on any one design project, really limit yourself to 2 or maybe 3 fonts max. Now, the one exception to that kind of rule is if you are doing a variation or a reference to Victorian design, because one of the things about Victorian design, they appeared to have a belief that the more fonts, the better on it. So here's some other examples with labeling that you can see. And again, this just kind of overabundance of decorative things, scrolls and shields and seals, things to make it look more official, multiple fonts in any one piece. So at the end of the lecture, I'm going to show you modern variations on all these designs too. As we get later in the 1800s, there's a school of design that came into being called the Arts and Crafts movement. What it was most noticeable really was in furniture design and houseware design. But one of the things that echoes our time today too is what you see with arts and craft is a lot more introduction of organic elements in the design. There was a real kind of blowback against how mechanized modern life had become, and you see this addition of more organic and natural elements in the design. Now you see that in contemporary design today too. A lot of people feel that our lives are now ruled by digital media, and sometimes getting back to something that looks hand done, looks like there is a human involved, is important to the design as well. More examples of late 1800s, the arts and crafts design aesthetic. Again, you can see all that kind of organic, natural elements or subject matter here. And I always talk about there's always echoes of previous eras. And one of the things you'll notice with a lot of arts and crafts design, and also the Art Nouveau period that follows this, is there are echoes of even earlier design. These are 2 pages of Celtic book design. The Celts lived in modern-day Britain and Ireland, and especially the monks of the time were expert at taking scripture. These are all hand-illuminated pages done by hand. And you can see the decorative elements that are added in here. And again, a lot of natural, more organic elements. So you can see that in arts and crafts. You can also see it in the style that came after arts and crafts. They actually overlapped. And that's what we call the Art Nouveau period. And this is where a lot of those natural elements really become much more stylized, even more abstract. And here you can see examples of that with Art Nouveau. Probably the best designer and artist of the period as far as graphic design goes was Alphonse Mucha. And he was famous for doing, in particular, these posters for theater productions starring Sarah Bernhardt. She was somehow his muse, and so he did lots of different posters for her various theater productions. But again, you can see where that organic or natural element really kind of gets stylized. And if you look at, in particular, the model's hair on the Job cigarette packaging design, you can see the hair actually starts turning into almost vines and kind of uncontrollable natural elements there. Cubism from the early 1900s isn't really a graphic design style. This was a school of painting. And I put it in here because there is a lot of later design that you can see references to Cubism. And what I always tell people is Cubism was the first stab at virtual reality. And the idea with Cubism was to try and capture your subject not just from one angle, but from all different angles. So in the center, you can see a very famous piece by Pablo Picasso. And the idea was he was trying to capture the model both from the front, but you can see with the way the nose is treated in profile, you can see the body parts are sometimes rendered as if they're from the front or from the side or from the back. So it was almost like trying to get a 3-dimensional view of the subject matter. It was also big in trying to get motion into it. And motion is what really drove this other school of painting. This is Futurism from the early 1900s in Italy. And that was all about trying to imply motion in the painting. And this is another school of painting where, although it's not really a reference to a specific design style, you'll see some references in later graphic design to Futurism as well. I mentioned earlier the Dada movement of the early 1900s as well. Dada was another reaction against how mechanized society had become. And in this case, this was the era when mass market magazines first started circulating with photography in them. And what the Dadaist artists did was they would take these cheaply printed images and they would cut them out, collage them together to make a statement about using all these mechanized images to create art. And as I mentioned earlier, when we get to the 1990s and the grunge movement, you're really going to see the influence of the Dada movement in that period. De Stijl is another painting or fine art style, Dutch movement, which stands for, or in Dutch, it is the style. And this was a school of painting or a school of fine art that really tried to reduce things down to a grid. And using primary colors, just usually black and white, red, blue, and yellow. And I put this in here because, again, you'll see reference to this when we talk about Swiss design in the 1940s and 50s. The Bauhaus movement was a German school of design. It encompassed everything from graphic design to furniture design, theatrical production, and it was considered cutting edge for its time. Here's some examples, famous examples of Bauhaus work. Now, a lot of the instructors and practitioners in the Bauhaus were Jewish, and when the Nazis came to power, many of them saw the writing on the wall and fled, many of them to the United States, where they continued their career and their design. In the center there, you can see the original Bauhaus building, which to us doesn't look that spectacular, but when you consider this building was built in 1919, it was way ahead of its time. Now, despite all the destruction in Germany during World War II, the Bauhaus School has stood all these years and just recently celebrated its centennial. Also around 1919, you get Russian constructivism. The Bolsheviks had overthrown the Tsar and taken over Russia and formed the Soviet Union. And you can see this design. There's a very propaganda style to this. Now, later in the lecture, I'm going to show you the work of Shepard Fairey, and you'll really see that he is indebted to this kind of propaganda style of design. Into the 20s and 30s, another fine art school, Surrealism, but again, from my business working in the entertainment industry, for a lot of movie posters, we really kind of riffed on a lot of surrealist ideas and looked, especially the work of Rene Magritte. Here you can see on the left Salvador Dali's work. He's probably the most famous surrealist, but on the right, two examples of work by Rene Magritte, who, again, if you work in the movie business, we reference Magritte all the time. Then once we get in the 1920s, we get into the Art Deco style. This is, to this day, one of the most enduring and popular styles. This was the Roaring 20s. There was very much a sense of optimism. World War I had concluded. There was prosperity. There was also a lot of advancements in technology. So you see a lot of references to motion and movement, progress, moving forward. There's optimism you can see in the famous architectural top of the Chrysler building on the right. You can see the kind of raising sun motif there. You'll see a lot of very stylized and almost abstract things being reduced down to geometric forms. You can see in the train, in the famous poster in the center by A.M. Cassander. But even there's a cover of Vogue magazine, and you can see the model's been very stylized. The rainbow is done in very kind of geometric pattern as well. More examples of Art Deco design. Again, one of the enduring styles. People to this day love it. If you look at the Conoco magazine cover on the left, you can see what I mean by taking things and really stylizing it. So that's the stylized version of the goddess Diana. Excuse me, in The Hunt. Very famous movie poster on the far right for a movie of the 1920s called Metropolis. You also see Art Deco in architecture. So New York has a lot of Art Deco architecture in it. Also in South Beach, Miami, where you can see on the left there. But downtown Los Angeles also has its share of very well-known Art Deco architectural buildings. As we move into the 1930s, you get the Works Progress Administration. This was a federal project. So we went from the optimism of the 1920s. There was the stock market crash. All of a sudden, we're now in the Great Depression. And the Works Progress Administration was a government program that was meant to try and put people back to work. So there were a lot of projects, things like Hoover Dam, big infrastructure projects that were put together to try and put people back to work. But the Works Progress Administration also had an art wing, and what they tried to do was create projects for designers, fine artists, people in theater and music. So here you can see taking kind of the abstraction of the Art Deco period and stylizing it a little bit more. Once we get, and obviously the Great Depression led into World War II. There wasn't a lot going on in design, as you can imagine, in World War II. But once we get out of World War II, you can see some more modern versions of design take place. In the late 1940s and into the 50s, you have Swiss design, the international typographic style. The Swiss were very big believers in everything being organized on grids, everything being lined up, everything being aligned to other things on the page. And again, I showed you earlier that Dutch movement, De Stijl, which also was based on grid work as well. So you can see how that kind of morphed into this as we get in the 1940s. More examples of Swiss design as well. This was also too when a lot of design switched to predominantly using sans serif type, which you can see in some of these posters. In In the United States, as we get into the 1950s, you have what's referred to as the New York School or modernism. Here's some examples of that as well. And they've taken the Swiss design, but they've kind of abstracted it a little bit more. You see more kind of more organic shapes in here. You see things not necessarily laying on a perfect grid, but really a reliance on a lot of shapes and color fields. Out of the New York School, you get one of the fathers of American logo design, Paul Rand. There you can see two of his more famous logos, and then some of his poster work, where again you can see those irregular shapes. They're not necessarily perfectly geometric, they're more organic. But again, a lot of flat color work as well. And it wasn't just in New York. When we talk about modernism on the West Coast, probably the godfather is Saul Bass, a designer in Los Angeles. There you can see some of his most famous logos on the left. And again, he was very, very famous for movie posters that he did throughout the 50s and 60s. Those of us who design movie posters kind of view Saul Bass as one of our idols. But there you can see, and again, it's very geometric, but the shapes, they almost look like they're made out of cut paper. So they're not quite as formal as you saw in Swiss design. As we get into the 60s, you see the pop art movement, most famously for Andy Warhol here. Bright colors, kind of mimicking the mechanical process of how we print things. Also Roy Lichtenstein, who was famous for taking the lowly comic book and kind of elevating it into an art form all its own. The psychedelic era of the mid to late 60s, and it actually bled into the 70s as well. Here you can see more examples of that as well. But again, I want to draw your attention to the fact that a lot of these kind of more organic shapes and everything really kind of call back to the Art Nouveau period, which at that point was 50 or 60 years earlier. Once we get in the late 60s into the 70s as well, we get what we refer to as postmodern design. Famous, especially in New York, for the Pushpin school. But here you also see that use of kind of the magazine type photos and the collage effect that you saw in the Dada school as well. Another, and this, sadly, we just lost this designer a few months ago, Milton Glaser. He was another practitioner, and for graphic design, he is, for lack of a better word, the father of the emoji, because back in the 70s, he is the first one to substitute a symbol for a word. Famous in this New York advertising campaign. No one says I love New York. He took I love New York, took love out, and replaced it with the heart. And no one's looked back since. So we can consider Milton Glaser the father of the emoji there. But some famous poster examples that he did from that period. Punk really started in the late 70s and into the 80s, but again, that Dada influence of the collage. Both Dada and Punk were really rebelling against, the mores of the day, the polite society of the day. And then what we think of as New Wave, and most people tag to the 1980s, really started in 1979, and really started with one designer here in the LA area named April Greiman. She was one of the first designers to start trying to incorporate computers into graphic design. Up till now, everything was done analog. Everything was cut and paste. Everything was glued up on boards. She was the first one to take the early computer-generated imagery and incorporate it in design. Now, in 1979, they did not have Adobe, so some of the effects maybe look pretty primitive to us. But most famously, she was head of the design department at CalArts up in Valencia, and the catalog you see up here on the top was considered groundbreaking at the time. Also on the East Coast of New York, one of the analogs to April Greiman was another American designer, Paula Scher, really famous for her work for the Public Theater of New York. But if you look here too, you can see some kind of echoes of that Russian constructivist style with the type as well. Memphis is a weird little style, and it was primarily furniture and housewares. And it wasn't long lasted. It went from about 1981 to 1985. Even though it says 88 here, it was really already dying out by about 85. But it's taking a lot of kind of the shape work that you saw in Art Deco, but really doing much more whimsical design with it. So there was almost a childlike quality to a lot of the Memphis design. And the Memphis furniture always looked really cool and interesting. It was also really, really uncomfortable, I have to say. Getting into the 90s, famously we get into the 90s grunge look. And one of the people who was really famous for this, American designer David Carson, originally based in Southern California in San Diego and Orange County as well, and famous for really being the first to integrate computer design. And the reality is he didn't really know what he was doing. He was just designing things that looked great to him, good to him. And a lot of people mimic his style. It looks like it's probably pretty easy to create, but I got to be honest with you, it's very hard to pull this off and still have things be readable. And he's still to this day one of the few people who can do it successfully. But again, that aesthetic really took off throughout the 90s in the style we would affiliate with grunge. Also during that time, and actually earlier, because on the right you see the work of Keith Haring, who really started doing this street art style in New York in the 1980s. But even moving into the 90s with the work of Banksy, here you can see on the left. And this street aesthetic really kind of started bleeding into graphic design. You'll see a lot of influence of street art and a lot of contemporary art. Here's the work of Shepard Fairey, famous for the Obama Hope poster. But when you see a lot of Shepard's Fairey work, you can definitely see that reflection back to not just Russian constructivist work, but also propaganda posters and propaganda design from the Mao period in China as well. And then we start getting into more contemporary design. I put this one in here. This was on the left. You'll recognize that from the I Love or I Heart New York campaign I showed you earlier. This was a revision Milton Glaser did after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And I put it in there, and if you know anything about the layout of New York, the terrorist attacks took place in Lower Manhattan. And you'll notice on his heart in this poster, the bottom lower portion of it has been charred. So that's kind of a metaphor for the area of New York that was attacked. And so this poster was put out in the aftermath of that. Where design goes from here, it's hard to tell. But you can see influences of all those styles in contemporary design. So pictograms, if we go all the way back to original drawings of the first humans, you can see that's really reflected in a lot of the icon design that we do today. Here's a modern example of Victorian design for a label for a rum. Modern variation of Art Nouveau, the introduction of all the organic elements there. Constructivism, here you can see some retail shopping bags done in that style. Art Deco, again, here's another wine label that's done in an Art Deco style, so that's a modern variation of it. Cubism, you can see it in the Monterey Jazz Festival poster. Even the Bauhaus style in some design for office materials. The WPA posters, you can see that in some other type of packaging here. Modernism, there you can see it in a beverage. More modernist work in poster design for our friends at Disney. Modern variation of Saul Bass style with that cut paper look to it and the bright colors. Swiss design, there you can see with the grid and the alignment of all the type. Pop art, you can see this a lot. Here you can see in Jailbird, fast food packaging. Even graphics for energy drinks owe their nod to punk design. New wave design here you can see in ice cream packaging. And so what I want you to do when you're doing your thumbnail designs, think what style you might want to reference as a jumping off point. You don't necessarily have to finish up there, but I think choosing a style that you might want to explore will help you get your creative juices going as you do your thumbnail designs.